You just saw Megalith by Charles Wuorinen, one of the world's greatest composers. I'm quoting another composer, another MacArthur Genius Grant awardee, John Zorn. He's been the subject of accolades, come and sit down here, and praise since he began composing at age 6. The youngest composer at the time to win the Pulitzer Prize for his electronic work, Time's Encomium. He counts the MacArthur Genius Grant among his many awards, fellowships, and honors. Charles, an official friend of the show since the 80s, has in his over 260 compositions written operas. Brokeback Mountain is his latest, described as intricate, vibrantly illustrated and brilliant by the New York Times. Its world premiere in Madrid was an international sensation. He's written orchestral tone poems, concerti, symphonies, and myriad works for voice and works for ballet and modern dance, many for New York City Ballet and for tonight, Spectrum Dance Theatre. Charles is also an amazing pianist, a conductor, a former professor, and a co-founder of the Group for Contemporary Music. I suggest that the audience supplement my only too brief introduction with a good Google and take a look at his works that Works in Process is stored in our archives at the New York Public Library. Now, Charles. Megalith was commissioned by Works in Process at the Guggenheim, the Tanglewood Music Center, and the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. Could you describe how the project came about?
I don't remember who was first. Not to say that everyone is simultaneous. And by the way, I'd like to extend a particular vote of thanks to Ellen Heistein, who is the director of the Tanglewood Music Center, who has joined us tonight. I'm very honored to have her with us. It was, as so many of these projects are, a joint operation, as I say, by the three groups. The piece was first done in St. Paul last spring, and then in Tanglewood in the summertime, and now here. That's how it came about. Then what it is, of course, is a different proposition.
Well, you've written for a number of great performers, Anne-Marie McDermott, Ursula Oppens, Garrick Olson, and for tonight, Peter Serkin. Could you talk to us about writing for a specific player, particularly Peter Serkin? Does that influence
Oh, of course
the work?
It does. Peter is, of course, one of the most remarkable musicians in the world. And in addition to extraordinary virtuosity, capacity, digital capacity, and all of that, he has a remarkable gift of phrasing, so that when he plays, it is extraordinary eloquence. And of course, I thought of that when writing for him. And I must say, whenever I have a task to compose for a particular instrument or group of instruments, or the people I don't know, I always internally plug in people I do know, so that I feel as if I'm always addressing an actual being. In this case, of course, it was primarily Peter.
A concerto is defined as a musical composition for solo instrument, or instruments accompanied by an orchestra, especially one conceived on a relatively large scale. Is Megalith a concerto, and how did you settle on the instrumentation?
Well, I don't know whether the label applies or not. It's a piece for solo piano with a bunch of instruments, as you just heard. Beyond that, one has to remember the original use of the term, or concerto, was primarily, I think, referring to an antiphonal effect, a small group or even a single individual against a big group, which didn't necessarily always involve fancy schmancy virtuosity on the part of the small group or the individual. It was just, as I say, a kind of matter of the one or the few against the many. I thought of this piece from the beginning as a kind of antiphonal affair in which the ripieni, so for the chorus, so if you want to put it that way, although it's very much individuated into separate strands, would be the people that you see mostly sitting on the stage, and that the pairs of instruments, oboe and trumpet here and over there, upstairs, horn and trombone, would function in a kind of antiphonal way in relation to the piano, who is then a kind of anchoring element for the whole thing. Whether this makes it a concerto in what the New York Times would consider a concerto, I have no idea, and of course care less. That is essentially what it is. It's a piece in layers and strands in which the antiphonal duets are part of it, the soloist is part of it, and the so to speak chorus. So they don't want to denigrate the individual contributions of the instruments on the stage, because they are all also very much in their own speech individually, so to say.
And you use different rhythms, like, I don't know how to pronounce it, raga in this?
No, I made a big mistake when I was asked to write program notes for this. I confessed that the harmonic materials of the piece derive from certain plain chant in the West, and also from the melodic formulas of one of the classical Indian ragas, Raga Lalit. I should have kept my mouth shut. Because everyone who heard it said, well, I don't hear Raga Lalit in that, and I know Raga Lalit very well. And I said, well, you're not supposed to. Many of these things are best kept quiet, I think.
Now, to focus on your works for dance, I'm going to introduce Donald now, our choreographer for this evening. Donald, described in contemporary Black biography by Robert Jacobson as one of the most important choreographers in modern dance, has been working on the East and West Coast since the 80s. He started off as a musician. He played the flute as a child and was educated at Yale and Tufts, on the faculty at Cal Arts. He's a Bessie Award winner, among many honors. He's choreographed not only for his own company, with such works as The Minstrel Show, The Harlem Nutcracker, and Jazz Train, but many other contemporary dance companies, Alvin Ailey, Dayton Contemporary Dance, Philadanco, and classical companies, Pacific Northwest Ballet, Joffrey, Dance Theatre of Harlem. Donald's worked extensively in film and theatre, including The Color Purple, for which he was nominated for a Tony Award. And now with Spectrum Dance, based in Seattle, he's been able to pursue dance as an art form and as a social civic instrument. However, Donald and Charles have never before worked together. So I'm going to ask them how this came about and how they appreciate working with each other, and Charles particularly how he sees composing for dance. Does it vary from other types of composition? So Donald first and then Charles.
Okay. Charles and I don't remember when we met. It was more than 10 years ago, I know that. And it was Mary Sharp Cronson introduced us, and she says, oh, you should do something together. And so we talked about doing something, but there was never an opportunity. And the music of Charles's that I listened to, it was for large ensembles, and I didn't see how I could afford a large ensemble, but I still kept, it was still in the back of my mind. And then I think, was it 2 years ago, that interpreting Zorn here, Charles was the moderator for that conversation. And after that, I said, well, maybe we should look at trying to do something together. So then it was embedded in here that I would find an opportunity to work with him.
And the commission was with a group of dancers to other quartets. Would you like to explain that, how you chose Charles's?
Well, it actually was, I think it was something I read in the New York Times. Alistair Macaulay wrote this article. It was I think it was not a review. It was a series. It was a comment on New York City Ballet and how New York City Ballet was quite extraordinary in terms of that it had probably commissioned more contemporary ballets than any other dance company in the world, and that was quite extraordinary. And he talked about that it made him wonder about American music and the possibilities of dance with American music. And so I said, oh, that's a good place to start. And then I could work with, maybe I should look at string quartet, because somewhere in my education and growing up, I had read somewhere or heard somewhere that the string quartet was the base, was foundational in terms of composing for Western music. And so that composers, they weren't big, but they gave them the harmonic freedom and the melodic freedom that a large ensemble could. And so I started looking at string quartets. So I began with Charles Ives. So a very short quartet of his that runs maybe a minute and a half, which in some ways is very typical of his iconoclastic nature. And then a quartet of Aaron Copland, and one of, as a child, as a teenager, I was I love wind ensemble music because I was a wind player, and so Vincent Persichetti wrote a lot of music for wind, and so for winds, and so I looked at one of his string quartets. I looked at several of his string quartets, and one I particularly liked. And then as I kept moving up, and then I said, well, there's Charles Wuorinen, whom here's an opportunity. So I actually called Howard Stokar and asked him, I said, how many string quartets are there of Charles? He says there are quite a few, and he sent me recordings, and I listened, and I settled on the second string quartet, and then a short string quartet of John Zorn's. But I will say that the thing that I was attracted to about Charles's second string quartet was it had a feral quality about it that I really liked, that it seemed not so it was ordered, but it seemed that at any minute it could just kind of go off somewhere, and so I was really intrigued by that.
Did you see that, Charles, when you wrote it?
I don't know. Look, my problem is I have a very good forgettery. And usually when I finish something, even the latest thing, I tend to put out, as much as I can, put out of my head what I've done. This piece, I think, is 36 years old, and should be raising a family by now. So I, talk about original intent. I can't really tell you in an honest way. I approach it as if it were a piece almost by another person. Although, of course, I do have an idea of the way I'd like to have it played. And I have to say, by the way, in that connection, that the performers we have this evening are superb, and I'm very grateful to them for preparing the performance, especially for this occasion. But as I say, at this distance of time, it's hard for me to say, but I'm very happy to hear if it strikes you as having a feral quality, that's fine with me.
So, Charles, what are the pitfalls you found composing for dance?
I think it's again, I think it would be fatuous for me to try to say anything really, really basic about it. The things that I have done or did some years ago for the New York City Ballet seemed always to want to be sectional rather than through composed. In other words, to allow for a kind of large-scale articulation, but not in enormously long pieces. What you just heard now, for example, is a good instance of something. It is through composed. It's a line that goes all the way from beginning to end, in spite of its changes and disruptions and disjunctions. But it isn't sectional in the sense that you have a thing here and then a thing there and then another thing, even though they're supposed to be coordinated and balanced. So I think that is one aspect that struck me anyway as something that a lot of people in dance would find desirable and easier to get a handle on.
Donald, you told me earlier that this was the first piece you'd choreographed to that you hadn't actually read the score.
Yes.
So tell us more about it.
Yeah, usually I will look at the score. I mean, I love that word when you call the publishers and say, can you send me a score for perusal? And so, so I love asking for them just so I can use the word. But this one I did not. And I think one of I'm trying to think why I didn't. Because I think I didn't because it forced me to listen and to pay attention to what was being played. One of the things that, the scores are graphic. They tell you, they can give you a lot of information just from looking at them. You can see how the ideas are organized. But it's music, so you want to hear how the ideas are organized. And so I had to listen to the music very carefully. And I was lucky that there was a recording that I could do that, and I could listen. And so it also allowed me to, in some ways, to fall in love with the music because I'm listening to it daily, and so I fell in love with it. I mean, and even now, what the dancers are working with, they hum little bits and pieces. When we were talking to the musicians, how do you they go, well, where is that? And because I hadn't looked at a score, I didn't know what bar it was. I didn't know, it's 147. I didn't know where it was. So they say, can you hum a little bit? So they would hum a little bit, but the musicians would know where they were. And it was a little bit like that for me. So I love that process of not having the music, creating it from all being in my head, understanding it intellectually, but learning, kind of understanding or having a feeling for it viscerally and intuitively. And so the process of creating it became very satisfying. And I think it was pretty quickly, I did it pretty quickly, so in a week.
Well, Charles, you've seen your work performed as opera and as dance. Do you, when you're writing it, see it as a performance?
Well, I can't honestly say that I would in the case of choreography because I don't necessarily know what's going to happen. But with a stage work, with an opera, of course, I have very much in mind what's going on the stage. One has to. And inevitably, although I wouldn't be able to tell you in precise terms how, that has an effect on the music one writes, certainly. But when it's a stage work or a narrative piece or something like that, I certainly have the entire picture in mind. It isn't a matter of writing music which then gets plugged into another entity. I don't think such a thing would work.
I think one of the things that you said to me 2 years ago when we were talking, you said you were always surprised how choreographers heard your music and the choices that they made for certain parts of it. And that stuck with me when I started working with this, about how not so much that I was doing something that might surprise you, but like your organization, the principles that you use to organize, that mine would be different, and that you may or may not be able to see those, but they might surprise you because the organizing principles are
well, absolutely. The thing that I would have to say is, if I were to imagine physical movement to a score that I've written, my natural and almost insurmountable tendency or habit would be to have everything simply a direct visual magnification of what I've done rhythmically and harmonically in the score. But of course that's not what would make it interesting. I mean, you don't really need that because the music already exists. It presumably supplies that. Yeah. But from the point of view of my limited choreographic or dance imagination, as opposed to my presumably somewhat satisfactory musical imagination, what I would do would be, I think, hopelessly literal, and not interesting at all. So that's why I suppose what I mean by surprise. And also one has a certain feeling of satisfaction, since for practical reasons, in most cases, the music has to exist first. A certain kind of one has a certain kind of feeling of being honored by being used in this way, if you know what I mean.
I often think when I work with music that, a little bit like you just said, that why should I do that? The music's already doing that, and it's doing it better than I could do it. So what I need to do is to find complementary or parallel structures. So in a sense that the dance acts as counterpoint sometimes to the music, and they run along their tracks, and then sometimes they cross and intersect, and other times they run independently of each other, but they are all part of the same world. And so they create the movement, and the rhythms of the movement create not only counterpoint but also polyrhythmic kinds of actions on this.
Well, sure. And then when the moments of synchronization or synchronicity or one might say unison occur, of course they can be very dramatic. If there is a parallel between the two media. I mean, any interdisciplinary approach, any combination or combining of different media is fraught with danger and can easily come out badly. Yeah. But that's, of course, what makes it exciting.
And in the spirit of live performance, Donald, you performed this to recorded music. previously, or it's always been live?
Always live. I don't think we've ever done a public performance of it that was, I mean, except in the studio for a showing. But we performed with a quartet in Seattle, and they found the music really difficult. And at first it came up again. I think I was telling Charles that, no, I was telling Fred that we're doing it later this year in DC, and the presenter was trying to talk me out of doing it because the quartet thought the music was too difficult for them to learn as quickly as they needed to learn it. I'm not going to say which quartet it is, but so in Seattle, the experience that the dancers had was, I mean, I think the quartet did it very well, but they were scared actually of it. They were frightened of it. And then after the first rehearsal with the dancers, I thought they sounded very good. And then it started to, the tempi started to vary really greatly. Sometimes it would be really fast, and then as they got into it, then they started to play slower and slower, and this sense of forward momentum in the music started to be lost. The urgency of it started to be lost, which is, for a dancer, is deadly. They need that sense of it going and moving along.
So that's one of the pitfalls of working with different quartets.
Well, you talk about difficulty, and of course I've encountered this many times in my career. I've concluded that very little, and of course I can speak only of musical or instrumental or vocal performance. I can't say anything about any other area. Almost all of what is called difficulty is not physical but psychological, and comes from unfamiliarity. I don't think, for example, if you think of the piano literature, I don't think there's any music that's more difficult to play than the war horses of Liszt and Chopin, those things, or the Brahms concerti. But everybody plays them all the time because they think, anyway, or they claim, they know how it goes, and they can bash their way through it, or through them. But comes something that has not been seen before, and it becomes an issue of, as you say, of fear. And yes, there are some things that are physically, as it were, digitally very difficult to do, but the difficulty is mostly psychological, and once the barrier has been broken, then suddenly, it's not that hard after all.
There's this one correction. You were correct. We did do it once to recorded music.
Okay.
So
Well, tonight we have an extraordinary quartet. Fred Sherry, Dos Scheindlin, Jesse Mills, and David Bolin. Did you choose them, Charles? Did Fred?
Fred did.
Ah, okay.
Fred, with whom I've collaborated, a dear friend for, I think it's getting close to 50 years. Anyway, it's more than 40, shockingly enough.
You said 40.
It's more than 40.
You played in
49
together.
Yes, I think 49.
Well,
I think we first started working together in 66, 67, I don't remember exactly, in the dim mists of prehistory.
Well, I think that everybody is really looking forward to this. Charles has not seen the whole thing through, so I'm going to let Charles go and sit down. Donald?
Can I go sit down too?
You can sit down too. So here is Septet to Charles Wuorinen's second string quartet. Thank you.